Shaft is the studio known for archy visuals, head tilts, directorial self-indulgence and lots of fan service. The first full series they made was a Sakura Diaries in 1997, a typical ecchi comedy which lacked their trademark visuals, it was left incomplete, and everybody forgot it right away. Their second work was Mahoromatic in 2001, also an ecchi comedy, but because it was a collaboration with Gainax, it also had some interesting existentialism things about a robot running out of time and wanting to spend her last months with someone she cares for. It's dramatic enough to initially hook you into watching it, but just like plastic memories from some time before, it is doing very little with the concept and wastes most of its duration on plotless run-of-the-mill ecchi jokes. The ending is the most memorable thing about it, because of how bizarre it is, but other than that it's another forgettable ecchi comedy. The following years were pretty much wasted on making forgettable nonsense, 2 lines of a plot that heads nowhere, some fetishes to define the characters, and otherwise nothing more than mindless fan service. Bunny Pony Dash in 2005 is a slight exception, since although it's still another plotless comedy set in a school, there wasn't much fan service and the humor was creative despite being completely random and heavy on references. Did that make it a good show? No, but at least it wasn't about fan service. In 2006 they made Wreck, a short comedy that starts with sex in the first episode. They don't do much with the premise of adults trying to be in a relationship, they squander the chance of having a mature take on relationships instead of another aimless slice of life. Not very good, but at least it's a decent time passer. In 2006 they also made an alternative version of Nejima, a harem nobody even cared about, and the same counts for this one as well. In 2007 they made Hidamari Sketch, an aimless slice of life comedy about cute girls doing cute sketching. It's forgettable just like everything else of its kind. It was only in 2007 when Shaft became famous thanks to Shimbo going apeshit with the archy art style in Sayonara Zetsupo Sensei. Although still just an episodic comedy, it had great variety in jokes and characters, plus a lot of superficial social satire to please the hipsters. It was an anime that could please most audiences, and thus it's their first success both financially and critically. Same year they made A Tale of Memories, followed with its sequel, A Tale of Melodies, the following year. It's typical school romance tragedy, the likes of which we get all the time before we forget them in a couple of months. Anohana eclipsed it in an instant, and Your Lie in April is the recent specimen of its kind, the only one people talk about, and the first they will forget as soon as the next school tragedy comes out. In the following years, Shaft made a bunch of lukewarm comedies and ecchis, none of which were special, since unlike Sayonara Zetsupo Sensei, they were very limited in themes and content. No amount of fancy visuals is enough to change that simple fact, and thus all these titles were forgotten very fast. All that pale compared to the second major title they made in 2009, Bakemonogatari, and its numerous sequels and specials. Otakus and pseudo-intellectuals, they fight this harem for its archy fan service, to the point you can't take it seriously even if you tried. Let's not kid ourselves, the whole thing is a harem, stuffed with every deviant fetish you can think of, and the psychological aspect of it is just directorial self-indulgence. I am not a pretentious overthinker, and thus I am not fooled to think it's anything more than well-directed rule of cool, instead of simply fan service or deep symbolisms. The third major title was Madoka Magica in 2011, which was hailed as the best anime of all times by tasteless casuals, edgelords, and pseudo-intellectuals. The Cash Grab movie sequel broke that illusion, and people finally realized the pile of bullshit it was all along. Princess Tutu for the win! After 2011, the creative juices of Shaft ran dry. Aside from milking the crap out of Bakemonogatari and Madoka Magica, they are not creating something new and worthwhile. They even reached to a point where their shows are nothing more than repetitive Shimbo gimmicks. They went so up in their own ass that nobody understands or enjoys them without reading the source material. If you remove the shafting from their shows, they are still nothing but generic harems and otaku pandering nonsense with no plot or theme exploration. They are selling based on fancy visuals and not on substance. The recent show they made as of now is the exception to the rule, as March Comes Like a Lion is a mixture of slice of life, sports and psychological drama. It's not nearly as bad as most of everything else they made, but it never made a big impact since everybody would always mention something like Ping Pong or Yuri on Ice every time it comes up to completely eclipse it. Thus, out of the 28 titles they have, only 2 are worth it as rule of cool. The rest are mostly fanservice trash, slice of life that never sticks out, and Madoka Magica being the cancer that killed anime because it was made by Urobucher. It got 7% on Sturgeon's Law, thus it's not a good studio. Gainax began as a group of fans making short videos for anime conventions called Daikon. Bandai was impressed with their work and gave them lots of money to create a high-budget movie. The result was The Wings of Honeyamiss in 1987, a coming-of-age story occasionally expanding to religion, philosophy and social critique. It is a very light film, many consider it boring and many others hate it for a scene of attempted rape. It is still very inspirational with great animation and no empowerment fantasy nonsense. The following year they created Gunbuster, which is also a light and inspirational coming-of-age story, but not boring by including bouncing boobs, huge robots and gigantic explosions. Very entertaining and still one of the best mecha titles of all time. Its sequel, Die Buster, is not as good, but it doesn't deserve the hate it gets by many, simply for not being amazing. It didn't ruin the original like most sequels have done, so even that is an indication of quality. The economic crisis of the 90s was a very hard time for anime. The inspiration and vision were there, but it's as if they stopped caring midway because there was no market to promote their work. Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water in 1990 began as a great action adventure and ended up very unimpressive, as if they felt it was a lost cause. Otaku no Video in 1991 was their way of expressing their frustration of wanting to create a great animation, but everything is holding them back. The anime fans of that time were also using them as escapism instead of inspiration for achieving greatness. Thus they created a pseudo-documentary presenting the dark side of the fandom, while also having a segment of someone aspiring to achieve his dreams. Very dry as a watch and ridiculously optimistic if you see how the industry evolved over the years, but its message is something very few dared to talk about at that time. This concept evolved further into one of the most iconic anime titles, Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1995. It combined the rule of cool from Gunbuster and the anti-escapism message of Otaku no Video, while also expanding to a dozen topics full of weird terminology for the pretentious overthinkers. It has many issues in terms of pacing, animation quality, and a plot that leaves most background information unexplained, but it completely changed the way anime are broadcasted and inspired every other studio to make dark science fiction that deals with the effects of technology and religion. Gainax achieved what it was going for, which is why it's such a praiseworthy studio. So what do you do once you achieved your dreams? Karekano in 1998 was a fresh take on school romances, since it was focusing a lot on the psychology of the characters instead of being a 200-episode cocktease that goes nowhere and is just excuses for fan service. It runs out of steam the more it goes on, but for its time it was once again exceptional. After that, they went for comedy with Furikuri in 2000, which despite seemingly being completely random, it still manages to be an allegory about coming of age and facing the chaotic emotions of teenage life. It once again inspires the audience to use jokes and imagery to tell an important message, instead of being pretty colors with nothing behind them. The same things apply to many of their lesser works. Although the message is often lost under constant referential humor, fan service and episodic structure, they are still comedies that aim to be far more than plotless bullshit. They have a message and it's not just otaku pandering. Of course they also had their share of bad series when they weren't trying to tell a message and were simply making soft porn garbage for the quick bucks. Nobody cares about those titles, they were quickly forgotten because they had nothing of value to say. Their swan song was Gurren Lagann in 2007, the best tribute to super robots ever made, and for once again being inspirational. Isn't it funny how Toei and Sunrise have produced hundreds of mecha titles, and almost none of them are as good as the two mecha series from Gainax? That's how talented they are. Sadly, said the talent was centered in only two people. As soon as Hideaki and Imaishi left the studio, everything fell apart and Gainax is a living corpse ever since, making only moe shit and pretentious bullshit. As a whole, Gainax was the most influential studio of all times when it comes to anime. It easily passes the Sturgeon test and has one of the best roster of titles in general. It's so easy to see how crappy Gonzo is these days, but back in the early 00s they were perceived as this godlike studio full of amazing ideas and good budgets. And yet if you look at what they have made, almost all of it is unwatchable. Poorly scripted, badly directed, stuffed with excessive fan service, and terrible CGI models. Some titles had something interesting going on, like the gender jokes in Vandred, where men and women live separately and need to coexist again as means to fend off a common enemy. If they had focused more on plot and theme exploration instead of silly ecchi moments and terrible CGI battles, this could have been a great series. But they didn't because it's Gonzo. They are given titles with infinite potential and a pre-existing fanbase such as Final Fantasy, and they don't know what to do with it. It was one of the worst promotions of any video game franchise ever. But that's the thing with Gonzo, they don't give a shit. They are paid to make terrible infomercials, leaving them incomplete and hope someone else will pick them up later on for a remake or a continuation. This was the case with Hellsing, a lukewarm tease for people to go read the manga until Madhouse made a proper adaptation. They made the first season of Full Metal Panic, it was a complete mediocrity, and then left Kyoto Animation to make way better sequels. The Moiblob studio made better action than the studio that was all about the action. Yes, they are that bad. Many were constantly defending the studio by claiming the only problem was the CGI. If you ignore it, most of their shows are fine. No, they are not. Yukikaze was an exception, the CGI they used was amazing for its time, the aerial battles were spectacular, the concept of alien war was looked into, there was no fan service and all the characters were mature adults. It was still not a good series because the script was an unfocused mess of ideas with no character chemistry. It was all mechanical, dry and lifeless. It was not the CGI, it was the people making the shit not knowing what they were doing. Which is why one of their best series is Gravion, a generic mecha with not much of a plot, heavy on erotic humor, and characters who are caricatures. It was poking fun at stereotypes of the genre and had a bloody good soundtrack. It's fairly forgettable as a whole, but as dumb fun it was honest and self-aware of its cheesiness. It was good as trash entertainment. When they kept expectations low and focused on simple stories with emphasis on characters instead of god-awful CGI, then they were producing decent titles. Kaleido Star was family-oriented, but it also had likable characters and was motivational in telling children to chase after their dreams. But that's the thing with Gonzo, they didn't want to do basic stuff. They always wanted to chew more than they could swallow, and the result was producing dozens of series full of great sci-fi ideas that were never used properly, CGI that felt very off-putting, and lots of done-to-death fan service bits that were there simply for increasing the sales by shredding the dignity of characters who had the depth of a plank. And yet most people didn't realize it at all, they were mesmerized by the adaptations of very famous works. Hey guys, look, it's the modernized version of all-time classics. They have robots, take place in space, and have magic trees. Just don't pay attention to how they are stretched to last way longer than they needed to, how they overcomplicate the plot so it can become a convoluted mess, or how fancy colors and mechanical backgrounds add nothing to the actual show and are more like distracting you from what is going on. They were offending the source material by making it look shallow and stupid. Another thing most people didn't realize was how ultra-violence does not make a show mature. Gonzo made some of those as well, which were considered deep and meaningful when they were just shock factor and are now forgotten, because once the thrill is over and you never cared about the characters, you also have nothing to remember the show for. Bokurano is an odd exception, since lots of people still remember it and still consider it one of the best anime of all times. It was just misery porn about the children suffering and dying. What was even the message of this bullshit? Children must die so some cosmic horror will not blow the planet just because? And this is just one of countless dimensions? Who gives a shit if one of them gets destroyed? Who gives a shit if a billion planets blow up? They are countless, it doesn't matter. This show is terrible. If there is one anime that is totally worth it, it would be the one that goes against everything they are known for. Character-centric, no schlock action, fanservice, shock effect, or untapped sci-fi. Welcome to the NHK was the one and only time Gonzo went against a stereotype and made something you would expect from Gainax. A critique against escapism and the dark side of anime. Very optimistic and goes in circles, but still more meaningful than everything else they made combined. This is their best work, not that torture porn about kids suffering. Anyways, Bokurano and Welcome to the NHK was their best moment. After that, they began having major economical problems and barely managed to stay afloat by producing effortless bullshit to this day. As a whole, they only have one great show and two more that are okay but nothing amazing. They failed hard on the Sturgeon test and are thus an awful studio. Bones is all about good animation and bad storytelling. You could excuse them at first for making films out of pre-existing series and didn't have much time or liberty with them, such as the pointless retelling of Escaflowne or yet another standalone side story of Cowboy Bebop. You could also give them a pass for the couple of kid stuff they made, since their hands were tied at what they could show or how much they could work with the script. The first show with complete artistic freedom was Razafan in 2002. The anime fans back then considered it to be the most mature mecha of all times for dealing with lots of deep themes, because it was dark and depressing. It was promoted as the spiritual successor to Neon Genesis, and for many it was even better than it. From a critical standpoint, it's a mess. The battles are boring, so it's not good as action. The robot designs are ridiculous, so it's not good as a mecha. The characters are boring copies of the Neon Genesis cast, so it's not good as a drama. The plot is slow and confusing, so it's not even enjoyable if you just want to watch it. And the ending is one big fuck you because it's a global reset. That's how you see right away why Bones is no Gainax. Similar things can be said about Wolf's Rain in 2003. I can deal with the dark colors and the depressing atmosphere since it was made in the early 00s. Most were still a bit afraid of technology and being emo was in fashion. I liked its themes of death and rebirth, the dynamics amongst the characters were wonderful, music and visuals were fine. But the script is again bullshit. Very slow, very confusing and in a convoluted way. It's just 24 episodes of some handsome wolf boys being hunted and the world coming to an end. Slowly. The rest of it is melodramatic bullshit which makes little sense and doesn't matter because the ending is again a big fuck you global reset. Wanna talk about their most beloved title, Eureka 7? The one so many loved for its romantic aspect, even though it isn't about romance because that happens all in the finale, with the rest of it being a beta male trying to say I love you for 50 episodes. There is also something about surfing mechas and some weird coral creatures, none of which deserved 50 episodes or could excuse the aimless slice of life in between. At least there was no global reset this time. That would be found in the sequel, which was so bad, everybody pretends it doesn't exist. It proved they never had an idea of what they were doing with the plot, and everybody was watching the original for Renton to kiss Eureka after 50 episodes. Wanna talk about their other beloved title, Darker Than Black? Oh wow, look at all the fancy action scenes. Hey is cool, he wears a mask, kills people with superpowers, and has no emotions. This is amazing. Forget about the mystery of how they got power, since the whole show is just standalone missions about characters with no emotions, whom we will never see for more than 2 episodes. But who cares? Hey's cool and there is no global reset. And then the sequel happens, which has an ongoing plot, gives Hey emotions, and explains the mystery in a convoluted way, which includes a global reset. Do you see a pattern forming somewhere in here? If you do, you know exactly what to expect from most of their shows. Cool visuals, characters with dramatic pasts and lots of potential, premises that can expand to 1,000 interesting topics, not a dumb attempt to make any sense out of the story, and oftentimes reset everything at the end. I mean, yeah, you can find a meaning if you overthink the whole thing, but if you have to resort to theory crafting or external information to make sense of something, the show is not well written. And now for when they did things right. Sword of the Stranger has a very simplistic plot, it is not pretending to be more than that, and has excellent action scenes. This is after all why the Cowboy Bebop movie is also amongst their best titles. They also do a fine job when they are given a prepared script instead of writing one themselves. Such is the case with Fullmetal Alchemist. They didn't follow the manga in the first version and it became bullshit. They followed it in the Brotherhood version and it was amazing. Same case with Soul Eater. It was amazing while they were following the manga and became boring when they wrote their own story. But just to make this clear, the manga lost a lot of its magic after a while, so it wouldn't make much difference even if they had followed it. What's unforgivable is how instead of making a proper version like they did with Fullmetal Alchemist, they instead adopted the terrible Moe spin-off, which nobody liked and killed all interest in a reboot. Uran High School Host Club is revered as the only worthy reverse harem in existence for being a subversion of stereotypes, despite not having much plot. Although the term deconstruction has lost its meaning nowadays, since anything can be called that if you overthink it enough, it still stands out by being the only one in its genre to this day. I can barely accept Tokyo Magnitude 8.0 amongst their good titles, since it focuses on a rather plausible plot of people trying to recover from a major earthquake. If it didn't have ghosts appearing just because, it could have been more psychological and less misery porn, but even as such, it's okay. And that's it with the good stuff. Everything they made after 2009 is just a sakuga with not much plot, and there are thousands of viewers who are content with pretty colors and no actual substance. There are 2 recent series have gotten a ridiculous amount of praise, and they call them masterpieces with deep themes or whatever, when they're just painfully average in theme exploration and characterization, and are also stuffed with pedantic messages that are presented as if they are thought-provoking when they are not. Bones has 6 titles in its roster that I approve of, and does pass the Sturgeon test. It is not a complete mess, but it could have been the best studio if its staff gave a damn about the script. Sunrise is one of the oldest anime studios, with a majority of their works being mecha and science fiction. I won't say anything about their shows during the 70s, since anime were aimed at children back then and there was no need for plot or critical thinking. The title which changed that mentality was the original Gundam in 1979, and the successive Universal Century timeline, which began an era where animated series with giant robots could be more than episodic silliness for kids. The man behind Gundam and many other Sunrise mecha is Yoshiyuki Tomino. The trademarks of his shows are are the over-dramatization of war and the deaths of most characters. By today's standards, it feels like everyone is acting over the top, but during the 80s, people with post-traumatic stress disorder or mental conditions in general was a fairly new concept. As cringy as it feels today, it was a breath of fresh air for the genre. As a polar opposite, we have another director, Ryosuke Takahashi. His trademarks are very somber, slow and depressing mecha series. Unlike the hyperactive paranoid characters of Tomino, his heroes are far more cynical and down-to-earth. Although that makes them far more serious and seemingly mature, it also makes his anime very dull and boring in the eyes of the average anime fan. You don't enjoy them, you more like tolerate them as you try to stay immersed in the atmosphere. This doesn't make them inherently bad, they just don't give you much motivation to keep watching. As for anything else regarding Sunrise, there isn't much to say. They can be held responsible for the oversaturation of the mecha genre, as they kept pumping out mecha one after another and almost every one of them is mediocre and forgettable. Some were great when they came out, but they didn't age well and it's very hard to recommend them today. Very slow pacing, not much content to keep you going. Exceptions include The Vision of Escaflowne, a great example of how you can mix a dozen different genres and still have a great action-adventure at the end. The shoujo elements were silly and the ending is kinda bullshit, but it still remains one of the most captivating mecha titles of all times. Another goodie is Cowboy Bebop. It's nothing much in terms of plot, but as far as production values and western-oriented rule of cool goes, it's the best space western of all times. There is also Planetes, which is one of the most enjoyable anime I have ever seen, despite a light plot revolving around garbage disposal men. Space makes everything better. But all things need to come to an end when it comes to modern anime, because in 2006, Sunrise lost its dignity and became the shameless whore we came to know so well. Their swan song was Zekapane, a thought-provoking mecha that is essentially the Matrix with giant robots. Wonderful ideas mean nothing before fancy visuals, and after the smash hit that was Code Geass, the guys in Sunrise realized what anime fans would pay big bucks for. Random bullshit full of fan service and completely chaotic plots that are labeled unpredictable. You know, Valrave, Crossange, blah. Gintama became the best anime of all times according to Shonen Tards, when it's mostly plotless referential humor and a very loose plot that was stolen from Rurouni Kenshin. Super Saiyan Bankai Sharingan Straw Hat plus Ultra. Ha ha ha! Such a funny story! Sunrise as a whole is a mainstream magnet. Some of its titles are amazing pieces of war drama in science fiction, but compared to the bulk of the badly written mediocrities they have produced over the decades, the ratio of good to bad is very low. Most of their best titles are part of the universal century of the Gundam franchise, with almost everything else being skippable and the reason they fail the Sturgeon test. Production IG exists since the late 80s, but it didn't do anything major up until 1995 with Ghost in the Shell, a movie that still looks amazing today, and it's one of the most mature and iconic films anime fans can proudly recommend to others before they shit on the live-action adaptation. This film is a historical landmark of animation and also signifies what the studio is all about. Great directing, splendid production values, and completely dry characters. It worked for the time it was made because it was about the cyborgs, came out at a time when Japan was still recovering from the economic crisis and its people were depressed. When IG made their second movie 5 years later, the results weren't as good, partly because the characters weren't cyborgs. Jinro feels more dry than inspirational. The themes are still mature and the presentation is superb, but it's just not fun. Not bad, just too boring to keep you watching because the people in it are distant and emotionless. This is, in a nutshell, the problem with the studio. Very good ideas and production values, but also very dry characters and slow pacing. Despite most of their titles being praised for the food for thought they provide, almost everything they make gets forgotten fast because there is nothing to identify with. And even that respect was lost after 2011, when the studio sold it out to the tasteless masses and began making crowd-pleasing mediocrities and cringe otaku pandering. The quality of writing dropped almost vertically, despite more people watching their crap nowadays for being easily digestible nonsense. The only two shows I like from them, other than the serious version of Ghost in a Shell, are both satires of stereotypes and have very little content besides the comedy, meaning they are the exact opposite of what they are known for. I would gladly pick a simple comedy over a complicating snore fest. As a whole, IG is a mostly miss studio because they either make something elaborate but boring, or they make it fun and brainless. Manglobe's first work was a Samurai Champloo in 2004, an episodic road movie type of adventure full of comedy, action and silly anachronisms. It was the title that described what the studio was going for, and it was in a nutshell the formula of Cowboy Bebop. Great ideas, good budgets, and unfortunately limited to an almost episodic format. Despite having the same director, it never managed to get anywhere close to the fame of Cowboy Bebop. It didn't feel special for the time it came out, and there was a lot of competition from established and much bigger studios. Despite the praise it got at first, it was soon overshadowed by Gintama and would be mentioned thereafter only as a lesser recommendation to it. Their second work was Ergo Proxy in 2006, and it follows a similar style. It was far more ambitious, rich in themes, mature in presentation, but unfortunately very episodic. Having a different director in almost every episode also made it erratic in atmosphere. Despite having a central theme, it was coming down to random ideas with very little uniformity. Unlike most other similar series, it doesn't become a train wreck and remains a series all the way to the end, but you were given very little to care about what was going on in a very loose and confusing story. Their third work was Michiko to Hachin in 2008, once again a mostly episodic road movie type of adventure. Compared to the previous two series, it had far more fleshed out characters and the setting didn't feel so random, making it a much more enjoyable viewing experience. But it was also very empty in themes, as it wasn't about an anachronistic Japan or a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It was simply a mother and her child traveling around the country and strengthening their bonding, something which wasn't giving you much to look forward to and ran out of steam very fast. Their fourth work was House of Five Leaves in 2010, standalone stories of various people, all of which are connected by the same group they eventually became part of. It wasn't exactly episodic, but there was very little interaction amongst them, since most of the show takes place in flashback mode when they hadn't met yet. Good concept, but just like everything else they had made so far, there was very little narrative engagement. After that, the second economic crisis began, forcing them to make lots of low-effort nonsense just to stay afloat. This ruined the image they had of a studio that doesn't do bullshit and focuses on interesting concepts. You can say this garbage had a plot and was far more mainstream and accessible for tasteless masses, but they were still garbage and a huge disappointment for those who trusted them up until that point. I can sort of give thumbs up to The World God Only Knows for being a deconstruction of harems, but that only happens in the third season. The rest of it is a satire of porn games, which, just like everything else in this kind, sounds amazing at first but then gets quickly forgotten. Also, having to suffer through 2 seasons of, you guessed it, standalone arcs, each one ending with amnesia so there won't be plot continuity, was an investment not worth for most viewers. I definitely give thumbs down to Samurai Flamenco for trolling people's expectations and then pretending that was the point all along. Once again it was jumping from one thing to another with little care for smooth continuity, before trashing the down-to-earth satire of superheroes for a mindless action flick nobody could take seriously anymore. Everything came crashing down in 2015 with Gangsta, the last show they made before filing for bankruptcy. Not only it was terribly bad as a rule of cool, it was also left incomplete and became a joke in the community as the anime which killed the once proud studio. Manglobe was fairly new and started off very promising, but was pitted against giants and eventually folded under the pressure of the demands in the industry. It closed down while still passing the Sturgeon test. And it was for the best, since it stopped before the bullshit overflowed the good stuff they made. It's hard to talk about the style and identity of a studio that doesn't have one, because it was formed for the sole purpose of making animation and not to offer some sort of ideology based on its directors. This is why A1 picture shows have close to no uniformity when it comes to themes or concepts. They are just adapting anything they throw at them by following a checklist of what must be included in order to make it sell. And as a result, they come off empty of life and content. It's like I'm talking about machines rather than people. The only thing which somewhat defines them as human beings is their butt fetish. They love to zoom the camera on women's asses. Their fighting shonen all look flashy and promising with their setting and characters, but eventually do very little with either of them. Shonen tards love them like the tasteless casuals they are, but if you look at them critically, it's not hard to see how shallow they are, just big explosions and fan service. There are many idiots who consider many of these shows to be masterpieces, when in reality they are just badly written empowerment fantasies and misery porns, with character designs they reuse in almost every show to the point you can't tell them apart. But even they made a few good shows. Birdie the Mighty Decode manages to evolve past what it began as. The first season is a generic action flick, but the second one focuses more on the dramatic past of its main characters. Very good in terms of action and drama, but sadly left incomplete. Shinsekai Yori has one of the best settings ever made in anime, tackling a dozen interesting themes regarding genetics and social control. Unfortunately, the characters are very dull and the presentation is often weak. Probably because all their budget was thrown at Sword Art Online that was airing at the same time. Why bother with this one when the other one is going to make us rich? Space Brothers could have been great if it was paced better and had an interesting progression. But as it turns out, it was slow as molasses and nothing of significance happens in it. It's still a nice time waster, but man, I never imagined how a story about space can be so boring. Planetas is laughing at you, Space Brothers! Silver Spoon is an improvement of the above since it is paced far better and the conflicts the characters face feel more important. It is otherwise still a boring slice of life time waster about milking cows and learning from where do eggs come from. And that's all that matters from them. Everything else is a by-the-numbers infomercial made to lure you into buying the source material, which is often a deviant light novel. They obviously failed the Sturgeon test and we are better off without them. A1 Pictures is the studio you go to when you want a good infomercial for crappy light novels, with JC stuff being the second option in case you don't have that much money. Whatever they do is mid-tier, and before the coming of the super fidelity of the mid-2000s, they were considered to be top-notch at promoting light novel garbage and mediocre romances. They lost a lot of their glamour once people began being interested far more in pretty colors, so nowadays A1 Pictures gets the buzz, while JC stuff is mostly mentioned when it comes to slice-of-life romances. Even those are of course typical nonsense full of forced drama, unrealistic situations, fan service, and no actual romance until the final episode. Their best work comes down to Ikuhara's symbolism in Utena before they got oversaturated by lesbian bears. Excel Saga, a fine referential comedy, much crazier and funnier than Gintama, and Azumanga Daioh, a fine moe blob comedy, the first of its kind, still pure and basic before everybody copied it to death and made moe nauseating. Those are obviously nowhere close to passing the Sturgeon test. They've made so much crap over the decades to the point these three are a drop in an ocean of shit. And if you thought that studio was bad, then you're forgetting Dean. If A1 Pictures is about high-level adaptations and JC stuff is about mid-level, these guys are the low-level. It wasn't always the case though, since when they began in the 80s, they had a promising roster from Rumiko Takahashi's school comedies and sitcoms, experimental shorts like Angel's Egg, and deconstructions of mecha like Pat Labor, which were turning the whole thing into slice of life. Nothing mind-blowing, but there was still variety and innovation. The only memorable thing they did in the 90s was picking up the highly acclaimed Rurouni Kenshin and making nothing but terrible fillers out of it. The OVAs on the other hand came out amazing for some reason, and were the only decent thing they made in 2 decades. They were quite famous during the Double O's, mostly for adaptations full of shock effect, such as Hellgirl, Higurashi, and the older version of Fate Stay Night. But the praise went away as soon as other studios came along with prettier colors to prove how shitty their production values were all along. As an exception that proves the rule, they made Full Moon, which is a good show for taking itself somewhat seriously for a change and doesn't evolve to complete bullshit, and that is the only decent thing they made in 3 decades. As for the decade we are currently in, they are mostly known for ruining Log Horizon in the 2nd season and for creating lots of autistic memes out of Konosuba, a plotless satire with no substance. They also made a show Genroku, a very serious social drama and the 3rd decent thing they made in 4 decades. But nobody cares about it because explosions! Despite all that bullshit, they rank a bit higher than JC stuff for not making nearly as much trash. Other than that, they are a disgrace to the medium. Let's move to Studio Wit, who many thought it would be the new best thing ever because its first work was Attack on Titan, the smash hit that made the tasteless casuals to yell how mature our anime thanks to it, and helped the anime community to grow by adding thousands of new fans, all expecting gore, violence, and shitty jump scares. Thank you, Attack on Titan, for making anime mainstream with your Shyamalan-level plot twists. After that, they made a bunch of titles nobody cared about since they were one-note and not a gore schlock for edgelords. So they realized people were only watching them for the zombie fad of Attack on Titan, and thus focused on making slight variations of it, none of which was remotely as interesting, and was quickly forgotten. There is nothing witty about Studio Wit. They simply got famous thanks to the popularity of The Walking Dead, and a bunch of pretty colors with no substance. An absolute failure in terms of quality. Although most fans characterize Pierrot as the studio of cheap jump shonen adaptations, they weren't like that during the 80s when they tried out lots of different genres. Adventures, mecha, sports, mafu shoujo, sitcoms, violent OVAs, a big part of Urusei Yatsura, the mother of all school comedies and harems, and even Area 88, one of the best seinen OVAs of all time. In terms of variety, they were kicking the crap out of all studios. But then the 90s arrived and they focused too much on making slapstick comedies and fighting shonen. This way they found an identity, but it was a bad identity. identity, because they were making too many titles and they were generic and forgettable. A few of them like Yu Yu Hakusho and GTO were great, but as a whole they oversaturated the industry with garbage. While the other studios would refine their styles with time and move to the dark sci-fi in the late 90s, Pierrot glued itself to the formula. It seemed for a while that their dedication paid off in a double O's with the adaptations of Naruto and Bleach, two of the most popular fighting shonen of all time. It made them lots of money, but as it turned out they were very badly written and even more badly adapted, since Pierrot wanted to milk them as much as it could with slow pacing, fillers and not much quality control. The 12 Kingdoms was something completely different for them, but even two suffered from a very slow pacing and an incomplete adaptation. Even after the fad of the big three died out, they still didn't change. They kept adapting shitty fighting shonens with shitty budgets for shitty shonen tards. This is who they chose to be, the shitty jump shonen adaptors, and that is why they failed the Sturgeon test. Studio Ghibli, the once Disney of Japan, is no more for several years now. As it happens with most studios, their success is based on the talent of a few men and not the combined effort of thousands of people. When those talents leave the studio, or troll that they do in the case of Miyazaki, there is no way for the rest to continue producing equally good titles. Even if they keep notes and try to imitate them, true talent is not something they can copy. The financial problems of Ghibli have a lot to do with their newer movies not making enough money to sustain a business that was refusing to go full digital. As much as most of us prefer hand-drawn animation, it costs a heck of a lot more money, and the breathtaking detailed sceneries translate to expenses far beyond reasonable limits. As for why the studio lost connection with mainstream audiences, it's a generational thing. The themes of their movies are about anti-war, pro-ecology, slice of life about children. All those don't interest modern audiences. The Cold War is over, ecology is now a meme most make fun of, and people no longer go to the cinema for watching slice of nothing happens with kids. The age of family-oriented animation is no longer a thing. Now it's all about violence, sex appeal and selfish protagonists. And nobody wants to see kids anymore, they want to see teenagers and romantic tension. The Ghibli heroes are too innocent, too plain, too goody for modern standards, and the themes feel dated and boring. It was working while Disney, their biggest competitor, was making much tamer movies, but modern Disney is much more action-oriented and even bothers to give some grey morality to its villains, while Ghibli removed action almost entirely and the conflict is almost non-existent. The disconnect with modern audiences gets even bigger when you see how much they mellowed down over the years. Their older movies were exciting action adventures with some tension and creepy atmosphere. Later movies are cheery, calm and safe. At an age when everyone is addicted to Michael Bay explosions, Ghibli expected it to stay afloat with sleep-inducing fairy tales. The themes are still interesting, but because of the light presentation, you won't care about them. I'm not blaming the producers for not making Michael Bay trash. It's just idiotic to expect movies that cost more than the annual income of small cities to make their money back without appealing to mainstream audiences. But I understand that Miyazaki is no Michael Bay. He's not a person who would decide the content of his movies based on what would please the audience, but rather on what he would like to make. There is nothing wrong with not being a sellout and betraying the beliefs with which you began your career, but you can't expect running a multinational, multimillionaire business aimed at mainstream entertainment with anachronistic ideas alone. That's not how capitalism works. You're not supposed to be yourself, you're supposed to ask is your audience. Miyazaki not only didn't do that, but was also honest. He openly stated in the beginning of 2014 how modern anime suffer because the industry is full of otakus. Something we already know, but also something the industry does not want to talk about. Especially if you're a businessman who promotes his movies to a mainstream audience. You are basically making creators and core buyers to look bad for focusing too much on escapism and fan service instead of characterization and important life lessons. And yes, it was the truth. But honesty won't make you money. If you are selling candies, you don't go around telling children that they will make them fat and ruin their teeth. They won't be buying candies from you, and instead go buy them from some other guy telling them it's magic and full of surprises or some shit. And it goes even deeper than that when Miyazaki deals with stuff his country systematically ignores. The Wind Rises is a movie that enraged a big portion of his fanbase, not because it lies, everybody knows of the numerous atrocities it committed in the name of fascism, but because it makes Japan to not appear as an amazing and heroic military force during World War II. It hurt their pride and made many to not support his next projects. Kantai Collection, on the other hand, is super amazing and makes a shitload of money for making Japan to appear cool, even if it's technically sex bimbos and no plot. This is what the majority wants to see, not the truth. And yes, it did pass the Sturgeon test despite all the negative things I said about it. Later movies are nowhere as good as the older ones, but very few are actually bad. Fuck you, Goro! AIC created dozens of science fiction titles during the 80s and the 90s, and it differs from Sunrise, which also made mostly sci-fi, in how almost everything were OVAs instead of series. This meant beautiful animation and uncensored over-the-top gore and nudity. I remember my younger self loving everything these guys were making because of that. But the older me realizes it was just sensationalism. If you shut off your brain, many of them are plain awesome in terms of hand-drawn animation. But critically wise, these OVAs were full of interesting ideas that were handled as action schlock. They eventually moved to making TV series after the economic crisis of the 90s, since the OVAs were simply not making money anymore. Television became the new advertisement for bringing in cash, not random VHS trailers. This is where they had a huge dip in quality since they moved from making a couple of OVAs to making 24-episode series. With the same budget, the difference is huge. They look badly drawn and animated, with most of the entertainment factor gone because gore and nudity weren't allowed on mainstream television in such volumes. The funniest part is how many of their series are alternative versions of the OVAs, so it's like you're first watching the short, fun version, and then you move to the long, dull version. Not all of their series are bad, though. Blue Gender is a very good dystopian survival horror. Legend of Black Heaven is fun as a coming-of-age comedy with a sci-fi overcoat. The TV version of Oh My Goddess was lovely looking despite being yet another plotless harem. For a video game adaptation, Persona 4 is amongst the best. Now and then here and there is also a series that was very cherished in the pre-Elfen Lied era, since victimizing innocent children translated in the minds of tasteless casuals as depth and maturity. Needless to say, it's the spawn of Satan and everyone must hate it. All of them pale in comparison to Space, Battleship Yamato, easily the best remake of a cult classic and a pretty damn fun space opera. The reason it came out so good is because it's an OVA series, combining the quality of the former and the duration of the latter. Plus, it's about space! With only 2 worthy titles, AIC doesn't pass the Sturgeon test. It wasted most of its resources on subpar titles. And now moving to the disappointment that is MAPPA. 3 years ago they were promising as a new studio, but eventually proved to be focusing only on pretty colors than telling good stories. Kids on the Slope was their first work. Everybody loved it because it was directed by Watanabe and wasn't taking place in the present, although neither of that made it any different than any other school romance nonsense. Proof of which is how nobody remembers what the show is about by now, they just remember the premise and who was directing it. Same case with their second work, Terror in Resonance. Hey, the premise of terrorism sounds amazing and it's directed by Watanabe again, so I guess that's enough for 90% of the anime community to label it as a masterpiece even though the writing is shit. But who cares if the colors are pretty, right? The third work was Rage of Bahamut, which I really liked for a while and had high hopes for the sequel. In retrospect, the writing was shit again and had nothing but pretty colors to keep you going. I mean, for a show based on a sleazy, storyless cell phone game, it is a superb and a worthy epic adventure anime. It just doesn't have much to offer beyond a hollow spectacle. The fourth work is Garo, a decent dark action fantasy. Its atmosphere and highlights are great, but suffers from a very loose plot and is mostly episodic. I liked the first one, but following seasons are not as good, so it's another case of watching it for the hollow action scenes than for a good plot. And it keeps going like this in every other show they made. The best thing about MAPPA shows is the variety in genres. They don't limit themselves by rehashing the same stuff over and over again, so at least you will be getting something completely different every time. Unfortunately, none of them is going to get any prizes for the writing. They are also not without their share of throwaway titles, which always manage to attract some attention at first for their high production values and magically inflict high doses of overthinking. Eventually, the illusion breaks and everybody realizes these series are nothing but pretty colors with awful storytelling and pretentious themes. MAPPA is basically another Bones. They don't care about the narrative and waste all of their resources on making stuff look nice. But unlike Bones, which despite its problems still has a few worthy titles, MAPPA has none. Even their strongest anime are okay at best, and for that reason they are a complete failure of a studio.
Madhouse has no identity. It is so big and diverse that it doesn't follow a certain logic or strategy in most of what it produces, other than generally making it well produced since it has good budgets. The thing about it is that despite being founded in the 70s, for a very long period of time it was only a support studio producing nothing significant up until the late 90s. They only began being noticed in 1998 with Satoshi Kon's films, where he was criticizing otaku culture in a mature way. And in general, 1998 was the year they began making very famous classics. They have close to nothing in common with each other, so there is no reason to talk about them individually. It will feel like I am randomly jumping from one thing to another. But presentation-wise, they all have something different to offer without turning out to be a complete mess. And that is the thing with Madhouse, they don't have an identity, but at the same time you don't know what to expect of them. They can deal with all genres and topics, while usually doing a very good job as a production. Of course, not everything they made is top class, and in many cases, it was even a complete train wreck. Although they have created way more titles than any other studio, and having more good titles in total than any other studio, this doesn't change the fact that they still produced a lot of crap over the years, which counts against them in the Sturgeon test. Remember, it is about quality over quantity, and it needed 10% of its titles to be good in order to pass. So, as much as it saddens me, I am sorry for saying that and don't hold it against me, but as a studio, yes, it passed the test! Which is crazy considering how much stuff they are creating every year. It didn't even go full retard after the second economic crisis began, as it happened with most other studios. If it was simply lots of people doing lots of irrelevant to each other stuff, with no planning or direction amongst them, this shouldn't have happened! So double thumbs up for the best studio of all times. Stretching the video to last longer, I will talk about UFO Table, the other studio most plebs consider to be the best because its nickname is Unlimited Budget Works. That is what makes this studio good, it has pretty colors! But please, let's go over the amazing titles this studio has produced thus far. A low-budget Fujoshi-bait episodic show about Bishonen crime fighters. 2 low-budget episodic comedies of complete randomness. 1 short in duration generic light novel adaptation. 1 generic ecchi comedy about twins wanting the same guy. 1 mindless action flick about cowboy criminals versus maid assassins in space. 1 typical cute girls doing cute things show, and 1 mediocre rushed video game adaptation. Oh, the quality, oh, the depth and maturity, oh, the amazing presentation these masterpieces have. But wait, then things changed since they began sucking the cock of Type Moon and blessed us with masterpieces such as The Guardian of Sinners, the most pretentious piece of crap after the second Ghost in the Shell movie, the Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night porn game adaptations, which totally have no plot holes or mostly useless characters. And let's not forget the best OVA of the 21st century, Tokyo Fish Attack. What a pile of overrated bullshit! A complete failure of a studio, proving once again how no amount of pretty colors can make a difference, and that hype comes from pretentious overthinkers and porn game players with no brains. Speaking of brains, the next studio is Brainspace. Brainspace is a victim of its own hype. It doesn't really have an identity or that much of a roster, and yet many gave it an identity based on the very few titles that they liked from it. Because if you look at what they have made, it is mostly stuff the majority of people don't care about. Just look at them. Tributes to 70s Go Nagai titles, which are way too bizarre in the eyes of both newer and older fans. A few sci-fi titles, which are too dark and dull for most viewers to give a damn. A few mediocre moe and romance shows which went unnoticed because they weren't animated by KyoAni. And then there is Bakano, the title that made them famous. Although hailed by most as exceptional in storytelling and characterization, the truth is it is just full of energy and perky characters doing weird shit left and right. It's not deep or that well written, just way more attractive than most other anime of its time thanks to the pretty colors. And yes, it is eons better than the passable mediocrities that were making up until that point, but it's also left incomplete. And this is what gave Brainspace its identity in the eyes of most people, even if it was far from the truth. After Bakano, they made other shows which were instantly overrated and overhyped because of the fame the studio got. But they were quickly neglected and forgotten once the novelty wore off and there wasn't much worth talking about. They had interesting themes, nice animation, likable characters, but other than that, their plots were all over the place or didn't exist at all. Oh, and what about Spice and Wolf? Many like that one. Yeah, Brainspace animated the second season, so it just took over what was already likable from a different studio. It wasn't their project. Plus, it's also left incomplete. Oh, and what about Penguin Drum? That is also a fun show. Yeah, that is the only thing it is. Fun. Not mature, all well written. Just like all Ikuhara shows, it is mostly symbolisms and fan service than any semblance of logic. Thus the studio realized it had nothing else to go for and went to animate Durarara, which is Bacano all over again but in a much more boring setting with much more uninteresting characters. And once again people got hyped about it because it's made by the Bacano guys, the people we had no idea they existed before making that show. And then they give up on it too, leaving it incomplete until some other studio finally continued the adaptation. So as a whole, Brainspace has produced mostly mediocrities and shows that seem to be interesting at first but quickly fizzle away. The very few titles many people like from their roster and seem to think their whole studio is pure win is Rule of Cool and Feels, a result of pretty colors and nice sounds than good storytelling. And even then they leave them incomplete. They failed the Sturgeon test, and at this point, I don't give 2 cents about them. As for the second studio I will talk about, I choose B-Train. They made a couple of generic shonen that were almost instantly forgotten, and then jumped into the emo generation of the early 21st century. Back then, they were worshipped for their Chicks with Guns shows, since they were perceived as very mature and psychological because they had sad music, and heroines who were spending 90% of their time being sad and with an identity crisis, talking sadly towards the ceiling before shooting incompetent bad guys with matrix acrobatics. These shows were very slow and nonsensical, closer to 3-hour-long moody video clips for edgy teenagers than action flicks or psychological studies of its characters. Nobody cares about them today besides Requiem for the Phantom, which is easily the most polished amongst them. And even then, most of the praise comes only from the final episode, and the fact Urobucher had a 10% of involvement in its creation, therefore it's a masterpiece. I still like Hack Sign, even though it is pretty much the same thing. It's just that they took out the bullshit action scenes and kept the video game setting as a background, dedicating most of the duration on the mentality of the characters. Yeah, it is slow as hell, it's just people talking with fancy music playing in the background, and you still need to seek answers outside of the series. But for a show about being trapped in a video game, it did much better than the other ones that came after it. The thing is, you can't stretch a good idea to last indefinitely. They made lots of sequels and spin-offs which were bullshit action and fan service. The original is the only one that is worth it. Aside from moody video clips for emos, B-Train also jumped into Fujoshis and created gay shit full of pretty boys nobody sane would bother to try out a single episode of. And they also animated that bullshit cash grab that was Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle. It's just excuses for Clump to make fan fiction out of the shows which made them famous after they ran out of ideas. Alas, times changed and the emo fad was dying out, while gay shit don't make much money because most anime fans are male. The stuff had to jump demographics before it was too late. They tried to get into seinen territory and the result was a disaster. They completely changed the art styles from gritty to generic fighting shonens. As a result, they lost their credibility and their shows tanked hard. The last show they made before reverting to support status was Hyugemono in 2011, a very uncommon type of comedy which is very hard to be understood or even be considered humorous by most anime fans. So even if it is fine for what it is, it just doesn't resonate with the audience. And that was B-Train, a studio that was doing fine while riding a single fad, but fell apart the moment the industry changed and couldn't jump demographics. Which, by the way, is exactly what the next one I will talk about managed to do, Studio Toei. Toei has this uncanny ability of foresight when it comes to the demands of the market. It can shift its way and try out new things when the need calls for it, without ever changing the content of the titles it produces and losing its way in the process. For a company that is producing its own anime since Astro Boy, this is brilliance incarnate. It doesn't become apparent if you simply look at the anime they are producing. You need to focus more on when they made something and when they moved to something else as a result of changes in the market. Quality-wise, they don't have much to brag about. From a purely critical standpoint, they are average in animation, just promotions for toys and manga, and easily digestible mainstream stuff. They've spent most of the 70s in making sci-fi, which may feel very basic and possible today, but back in their prime, these titles weren't simply one of the same, but rather the ones that established all the formulas of super robots, space operas, and schlock action. The audience loved them because they were still something new and exciting. That is why many of them are cult classics today, not because of content, but because they were the first to pave the way for others to follow. But then sci-fi stopped being fresh in the 80s, since all studios were making similar shows, especially Sunrise, which was responsible for the oversaturation of the mecha genre, because it was rehashing the exact same stuff to the point of making them nauseating. So the guys over at Toei used their Sword of Omens, saw the danger approaching, and tried out something different. And thus came the perpetual ongoing fighting shonen and the action adventures with people instead of robots and machines. As before, critically wise, they are all basic today, but in their prime, they formed the formulas and became lovable cult classics. But then, even fighting shonen became commonplace in the 90s, mostly because of Studio Pierrot. People were getting really fed up with them, plus the economic crisis wasn't allowing much of anything to be made. So once more the guys at Toei checked their crystal balls and realized it was time for something different. And the result was playing it safe with budgets by making sitcoms and school romances until the crisis is over. It was a smart strategy that kept them afloat during those times, and also a chance to try out something different. And it's not like they didn't do some innovation in the meantime, since they were the first who dared to create magical girls for teenagers. Despite Pierrot making dozens of mafu shoujo in the 80s, Toei was the first to move past little girls, once again creating a cult classic which paved the way for the Precure franchise to follow in the double O's, still airing today and still being watched by mostly adult males. At the same time, it is still winning in the perpetual ongoing fighting shonen department with One Piece, which is obviously eons better than Naruto and Bleach, and also leading in action adventures for little children with the Digimon franchise. And then we arrive in the current decade, where things are again getting stale. Because of Shaft's Madoka Magica, everybody's looking forward to dark and gritty magical girl shows and not more Precure. Plus One Piece has become awful. And what is Toei's reply to all that? More Digimon and more Dragon Ball, both of which will come out at a time when there is no worthy competition while being fueled by decades of nostalgia. They are cash grabs at this point, but still a brilliant marketing ploy. As for the Sturgeon test, yeah, they failed. Having foresight, it did not change the fact that they are only making mainstream mediocrities. But honestly, most of these mediocrities far surpass the failures of most other studios, which were trying to make some sort of dramatic sci-fi and failed completely because of the lame scripts. The simple and basic shows of Toei don't aim high and thus don't fail hard if something goes wrong. And let's be real, older fans of today got into anime thanks to Toei classics. Sure, most of them didn't age so well, they have small budgets, and are now seen as a schlock or entry-level nonsense. You will also be correct if you claim Toei is very good at promoting merchandise at the right time, thus making them better businessmen than animators. But if you see them purely from an entertainment standpoint, they are all about action and adventure without ever letting pretty colors and concepts that are mentioned but are never explored properly to turn them into pretentious bullshit. So the snob inside me may be making fun of how average and overrated most of them are, but the child I used to be loves them purely out of nostalgia and likes them for the cheese that they are. As for the second studio I will talk about, let's go with PA Works and its bland titles. Despite the founder having gained experience by assisting several different studios over the years, he didn't bother to give an identity to the one he is running. I am constantly misplacing anime by PA Works, thinking a different studio made them because their styles look so similar. If they don't remind me of a different studio, it's because they are so generic in themes and presentation. It's like they use the most stereotypical characters and settings in order to make the most basic stories imaginable. And the few times they try to make something more complicating with its own style and themes, they come out bad because of lazy presentation and cardboard characters. I don't see why this studio even exists. It has no identity, no style, not even competent directors. Can you believe there are lots of people who like this bullshit? Can you guess why they like blunt characters and generic settings instead of something actually special and well made? Well, let me tell you why. Because all PA Works have cute girls with close to no personality. They can be your waifus and behave in any way you like them to. To hell with those weeaboos, and to hell with this empty shell of a studio. Join me next time as I will say similar things about Studio Pierrot. Xebec began as a subdivision of Production IG, and its role was to animate second-class titles. This is why its titles never go anywhere beyond average. It even feels like every time a Xebec anime is about to become great, something really stupid needs to happen in order to prevent that. Like throwing a twist that makes everything feel retarded, or having the characters not caring much about really serious issues. As a result, only 2 titles from their time as a subdivision are still decent today. Nadesico for being a crafty subversion of cheesy 70s mecha, and Buso Ranking for being a fairly average fighting shonen that is executed with a minimum amount of bullshit. This is how Bleach should have ended. And even then, they're not exactly amazing since they are still fairly silly to the most part. Zebek could excuse its bad roster by claiming IG was restricting its capabilities. No, little studio, you're not allowed to make a good anime. Only I can do that. These excuses ended in 2007 when it finally became independent and was given the chance to find an identity, something more than that minor studio which makes second-class nonsense for IG. And it blew it, since the only stuff it was making thereafter is soft porn and really bland sci-fi. In other words, they really are incompetent. The only title that I somewhat liked from their after IG era was Hensemi, and only because it was making a strong character study out of a really creepy sex comedy. And not even that one is great since it just ends with nothing resolved. So yeah, that was Zebek, people with little talent making anime with few redeeming qualities. The next studio I will talk about is White Fox. When it comes to its identity, you can say it's the studio that never gives you what you think it will give you. Cunning like the fox in their name, all its titles are not what they seem to be at first. It started off by making Tears to Tiara, a porn game adaptation masking as an epic adventure. It didn't do well because people went in to see Knights and Dragons and all they got was a harem. So 2 years later, the animators realized how they could make the exact same thing again, only this time it would work. They would make the first half to be boring as hell, and then a crazy sci-fi mystery in the second, full of otaku culture, time resets so the lead can date all the girls without making it seem he is cheating, and science fiction mumbo-jumbo that will make the pretentious overthinkers to go crazy. And the result was Steins Gate, one of the most overrated date simulations in existence, because bananas in microwaves is meaningful and well written. Doo-doo-doo! They also made Katana Gatari, an anime that appears to be about samurai action when in reality it's about people talking for an hour and fighting for less than a minute while trolling the hell out of people's expectations. And that is the joke! There is a huge build-up that always amounts to very little at the showdown. Not because of incompetence, but because of crafty manipulation of tropes. Not bad of a series as long as you're not annoyed by the non-stop talking and the really convoluted motivations of its characters. After that came Jormungand, which is about weapon merchants doing all sorts of crazy missions around the world. It is supposed to be an action-heavy series, but the character designs are silly and the battle choreography is completely retarded. It is otherwise trying to make you think it is a series about its dramatic moments and fails completely at that, since all you get is a lot of really bad humor followed by really bad fighting around really badly characterized soldiers. Just watch Black Lagoon and forget this one. Then came a bunch of comedies with really crazy premises, which were making you wonder what the hell can they do with them. And they did nothing, they were silly and aimless. Still, the premises messed the expectations of most people.
The most recent successes were following the same trend by presenting schlock as mature, thought-provoking and well-written shows that mess with people's expectations once more, since they were expecting generic fantasy and got gore and sadistic villains instead. All the shonen tards instantly labeled them as masterpieces because they totally did not expect that. Of course, in reality, they are gore fests for tasteless casuals who consider anything that has a lot of blood to be mature.
And that is White Fox, a studio that many consider brilliant because being trolled is a merit. Otherwise, it is a one-trick pony that works only for those who are too dumb to think outside the box. Katana Gatari is the only worthy title they made, since everything else ends up feeling more pretentious than full of plot twists.
Sturgeon test failed!
Join me next time as I talk about the cancer that is killing anime, Kyoto Animation. Although Kyoto Animation was founded in the late 80s, it was doing support work for other studios up until 2003 when they finally produced their own series. The first title they adapted was a spin-off and a sequel for Full Metal Panic. They were far better than the first season, which shows how much more talent they have if they outclassed a veteran studio like Gonzo in every aspect, despite being their first anime. Unfortunately, it was also the last time they dealt with action and mecha, since it wasn't making money anymore. The era of dark sci-fi was over, now the otakus wanted cute girls doing absolutely nothing, and the result was a new fad. More shit! This was the moment they found their identity and became the Moeshet Studio. They made a long line of time wasters, which are okay if you see them as fillers between better anime, but the amount of praise they were getting by the basement dwellers because the colors were pretty was infuriating. It's just escapism and emotional manipulation, you fools! But what else can you expect from modern viewers? For them, aesthetics is what anime are all about. Who cares if the stories make no sense? All it matters is that they made me cry. And I love how they have some really twisted standards for what counts as good moe. Nichijou wasn't enough moe, so we're not going to buy it. And free is gay shit because only men are allowed to masturbate to cartoons. But the ending of Clannad is a masterpiece. We won't mind how they never kissed in Chunibyo, and it's not important what exactly happened at the final episode of Beyond the Boundary. You freaking hypocrites! Not all of them are a complete waste of time, though. Hyuga and the Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya movie spend a considerable amount of time in fleshing out its characters, despite still being cute and fuzzy to the most part. But are these enough to make up for the rest of the crap they have made for over a decade? Yes, they are. They haven't made that many shows, so to everyone's surprise, KyoAni passes the test. I still hate them, though. Moving to the next studio I will talk about, David Production. Some guys abandoned the sinking ship that was Gonzo and established their own little business in that lifeboat. They haven't really found their identity so far, since they are trying out a lot of different genres and their anime don't have many similarities to each other. The thing is, many fans consider them to be retro lovers, since they adapt very old manga and they seem to throw all their effort into making them as gorgeous as possible. And indeed, not only Level E and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure look flamboyant, but they also have a very old type of storytelling and humor. It makes them stand out from everything else that comes out today and are extra attractive for older fans like myself. Now, I'm not going to say this is their identity, but I will admit that this is what they are good at so far. Everything else is kind of shit, actually. So they passed the test for now. I wish them to keep going the same way, and I hope there will be a remake of Hokuto no Ken in the near future. And since the video is still too short, I will go over a third studio, the one called Go Hands. They hold in their hands everything that I hate about modern anime. Pretty colors and absolutely no substance, no subtlety, no depth, no decent characters, no decent writing, and awful sex gods. But at least they make a fine pleb test. Do you want to know if you're a tasteless casual? Watch the 5 titles they have made so far. If you like a single one of them, my condolences. The place my hands will go to is around your necks. Complete and utter failure. These guys make even KyoAni to look good. Join me next time as I talk about the largest studio nobody ever speaks of, Tatsunoko Production. Tatsunoko Production is as old as Toei, has made an equal amount of anime, many of which are quite famous in Japan, and cult classics for children all over the world. And yet almost nobody ever talks about them. Wanna know why? It's the cringe! Oh my god, so much cringe! You're just too uncomfortable to talk about them because it brings back bad memories. I was 6 years old with no critical thinking. I was watching television without having a clue if an animated show was anime, much less a Tatsunoko Production, and in just a few seconds I was feeling discomfort every time I was bumping on one of their shows. I couldn't explain it back then, but it was coming down to a subconscious line of questions such as, what the hell is wrong with those character designs? Why do they move so bizarre? Why are the jokes making you feel uncomfortable? And it's not like the writing could make up for the not pretty colors. The stories were always awful, with no sense of continuity or proper transition from drama to comedy. Even Sunrise tries harder when it comes to brain rot mecha anime. And sure, you can claim most of these shows are action comedies for younger ages where the script doesn't matter much, but even then they are still bad as action and as comedies. This is also the reason that was holding them back from becoming more famous despite their size and productivity. In the 70s they had to compete with Toei for Inland Erin shares. Toei mecha series were fun in a campy way, while theirs were cringe! Not many children were watching them, thus many of their shows were taken to late hours where very few cared about them ever since. In the 80s they were no longer restricted by Inland television airing shares, since they could ship their stuff in the West in VHS format. And again, nobody was giving a crap about their stuff, because almost all of them were silly comedies with shitty artwork and really bizarre humor. They still made lots of money by striking a deal with Harmony Gold and merging two of their crappy mecha titles as supposed sequels to Macross, which was made by a different studio, thus creating the American version of Robotech. And despite all the editing they did to merge them with Macross, they were still far from as good as it was. This is also something infuriating about them. The very few decent anime they made had to be heavily edited for Western audiences, to the point they were no longer the same thing. Gatchaman was originally a dark superhero action show with lots of death and mayhem. The Western version renamed it Battle of the Planets and added a lot of comedy, threw in a comic relief robot, and made it seem like it was a parody of Star Wars. Tekken Blade was also a dark superhero action flick and was changed considerably in the Saban dubbing, so the characters would be saying corny one-liners, and the transformation sequences were given a stupid narration so it will feel like it was a parody of the Power Rangers. This doesn't change the greatness of the originals, of course, but it sure shows what kind of treatment the Tatsunoko assholes were allowing their shows to have in order to sell. The only good retro title that was left intact for all I know is Tylor, and probably because it had too much fanservice that couldn't be edited out. And even then, it was still not as good as the OVA sequel, which was made later on by Studio AIC. And yes, they made Ping Pong recently, which all of you consider to be a masterpiece, but you know me, I don't care about some boring-ass sport. Gatchaman, Tekken, and Tylor had space and robots, and the fate of the universe was at stake. It wasn't about people playing with their balls. But I will still include it in their better titles, since it is at least more artistically looking than your average sport anime. And that is all I had to say about Tatsunoko, aka the Cringe Studio. They obviously failed the test, and now we need to suppress the bad memories all over again. The next studio I will go over is Studio 4C. Variety is their middle name, since they are doing a bit of everything in multiple mediums. Anime, video games, cartoons, commercials, music videos, you name it. But for the purpose of this video, we will stick to anime. Most of them are very short and closer to experimental animation, of which I have nothing to elaborate upon, because they are just pretty colors and I'm not a digibro. Anyways, there is way too much quality fluctuation amongst their works, which means everything they make needs to be experimental and as much different as possible from everything else. For example, look at the movies they made. Spriggan and First Squad, schlock action flicks with cardboard characters, retarded plots, and good examples of thrown away money. Princess Arete, an okay but otherwise forgettable fantasy movie for children. Tenkon Kinkrit, a very bizarre coming of age with a very uneven tone. In one moment it is goofy, in the next one it turns to a weird tragedy full of Dragon Ball action scenes. The concept is good, but one movie is just not enough time to properly develop it. The Berserk movie trilogy, which is very rushed compared to the older version, and the CGI is rather weak. And there is also Mind Game, a shorter version of Tatami Galaxy, a fine specimen of psychological introspection, because Yuasa Masaki is a genius! From series, well, they haven't exactly made any, since they are closer to short-in-duration standalone stories. Some are just anthologies of shorts by different directors, which are made to promote a movie or a game. Some others, like the Tweeny Witches, are a cool-looking twist when it comes to the art style of magical girl flicks, but is otherwise very basic in plot. Meaning, visuals aside, it is fairly forgettable. Detroit Metal City is easily the best amongst them, because it is a great satire of death metal stereotypes that doesn't stretch a single joke more than it needs, and ends before it gets stale. And that is why it is better than Gintama. So as a whole, Studio 4C is great when it comes to short bursts of creativity and entertainment, but falls flat in elaborating concepts, since nothing lasts long enough to be fleshed out. But they still pass the test pretty easily, and it's quite inspirational to see how many different things they are doing across so many mediums.
This will be the final studio evaluation, because there isn't much worthwhile material left to talk about, so let's go over in a hurry the remaining studios and end it all with statistics. Trigger was supposed to be the savior of anime by being founded by ex-Gainax members, but it was quickly proven to be unable to produce a steady quality of worthwhile shows, and aside from Kill la Kill, it keeps wasting its resources on crappy series that cannibalize retro aesthetics without doing anything worthwhile with the themes or the concepts. It's one of the biggest disappointments in recent times, and another proof of why we can have good things in modern. It passed the Sturgeon test because it hasn't produced that much yet, but by the way it's going, it will fail in a few years. Artland closed down in 2017 by being unable to sell the garbage it was producing. For the most part, it was only assisting other studios in big productions, such as the original Macross and the first OVAs of The Legend of the Galactic Heroes. The OVAs they fully worked on were short and were quickly forgotten, while the TV series they produced were forgettable comedies and soft porns. The few anime people still remember of them are really bad, such as the horrible Hitman Reborn, the crappy sequel of Gunslinger Girls, and the awfully handled Legend of the Galactic Heroes wannabe Titania. The only worthwhile title they ever made was Mushishi, and even that one is an acquired taste, since it's episodic and mostly works through its aesthetics and philosophy, rather its plot and characters. And even that is not enough to pass the Sturgeon test, because as I said, they made lots of shit and forgettable nonsense. And the final studio is HAL Filmmaker, which got eaten by another studio in 2010. They were not assisting others as much as Artland did and produced more series, but the overall roster is still pretty forgettable. The only truly great show they made was Princess Tutu, easily the best magical girl show of all times. They also animated the Aria series, which became the definition of a yashikei, but it's otherwise the same old boring bullshit of nothing happens, and I'm not giving them a pass for that. Some are fond of Oban Star Racers, but it's very kid-friendly and doesn't do that much as an action racing series set in space. The biggest missed opportunity they had was a skip bit. It could have been the best deconstruction of shoujo romances if it was fully adapted and wasn't fooling around for the most part. Thus, as a whole, it also failed the Sturgeon test. And here is the overall ranking of all the studios I went over. The end.